to talk to us about Giotto's company.
Thank you very much, Simon, and welcome back, everyone. Great to see you again. Tonight we are changing gears, at least from my perspective. The History of Art department is about 3/4 of the way through our courses that are devoted to modern art in Florence and Italy. So I've got a mind that's maybe more in the 18th century than the 14th century, but we're going to try to anticipate some of the material that we'll be looking at closely in our upcoming cycle, which of course begins with medieval Florence and medieval Tuscany the week after Easter. What I've decided to talk about tonight is one of the monuments here in the center of the city that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. If you've never been to Florence, we'll talk a bit about the center and the cathedral complex that we find in the immediate historic center of the city. And one of the monuments of that complex in particular is the subject of tonight's talk, and that is the bell tower of the Florence Cathedral. I've chosen this photo because I like the way that the bell tower is literally overshadowing the cathedral and the famous cupola designed by Filippo Brunelleschi in the beginning of the 15th century. The bell tower is older. It is an example of the expansion program experienced at this complex at the beginning of the 1300s that lasts right through the century into the life and times of Brunelleschi. So we're going back to one of the earlier contributors and architects of the story of this complex, and his name is Jotto Di Bondone. And if you've heard of Jotto Di Bondone, you've probably heard of him referred to as a great early modern painter. He certainly was, and I think that the architectural practices of this artist are often addressed marginally compared to his great works in fresco and tempera. We'll take a look at some of the works that give him this great claim and celebrity in terms of giving us perhaps even single-handedly a rebirth of the arts of painting. But before we do, I wanted to get our bearings here. Looking at this photograph, you can see that the cathedral, the bell tower, and the baptistry, which is a freestanding structure here in Florence, are the three principal structures of the cathedral complex. Here, I'm showing you two aerial views to get an idea. It's very difficult to include all of these buildings in a photograph taken from ground level, simply because this is not in a large piazza, which gives you space to stand back from them. You've got to sort of go from one side to see one side of the building and then sort of walk around to see the other side. So this is right in the center of town, and next to the aerial views, I'm showing you the elevation of the bell tower, again referred to commonly as the bell tower of Giotto, or the campanile of Giotto. And campanile is the word that we use in Italian to refer to bell towers, whether they are bell towers of churches or city halls or other forms of structures. And for those of you maybe coming from the north of Europe, looking at a freestanding bell tower that isn't attached or incorporated into the facade of a building might be strange. This is rather common in Italy. One of the best examples is the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I think that maybe some of the underinformed visitors that make their way to Pisa to look at this tower and get that classic photograph are surprised to learn that it's not just a freestanding tower, but it's in fact the bell tower of the Pisa Cathedral. Here you can see at Pisa also that the baptistry is freestanding. So this is something that we find in central Italy, northern Italy, to have separate buildings. And I'm just going to talk tonight about one of the buildings back in Florence, again, because it is related to an important figure who takes over the works of the entire complex following the interruption of work and building due to the death of the original architect, whose name was Arnolfo di Cambio. I'm showing you a commemorative 19th century sculpture of that architect here, together with the view of the central nave looking towards the altar and the crossing of the Florence Cathedral. This cathedral was begun in 1296 to replace an earlier structure that had served for some time as the cathedral of the city, and that earlier church was dedicated to Saint Reparata, or Santa Reparata. The remains of this building can be accessed today by going below the cathedral floor into excavations that were carried out in the 1960s and early 1970s, based on those excavations and the descriptions of this church from historical documents. We are able to reconstruct with a high level of certainty what this would have looked like, together with the baptistry, which was often cited by Florentines in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance erroneously as the oldest building of the city. In fact, a Roman pagan temple dedicated to the war god Mars that had been converted by the city's earliest Christians into a baptistry. We pretty much accept that there's little truth to this, again, because we've excavated in the interior and around that building as well. And those excavations, again, give us an idea of how that earlier cathedral space would relate to the present day footprint or plan of the cathedral and Giotto's bell tower. What you'll also notice here, I'm not sure if you can make it out, but there are a bunch of little crosses drawn in here in the square around the baptistry. And that reminds us that it was a very common practice to have cemeteries immediately within the vicinity of these religious buildings. And during those excavations, many of the tombs were rediscovered and in fact documented. So this is going to be a long, drawn out process to give a new, larger cathedral for the Florentine people, whose population has boomed since the middle of the 1200s. Their economy has boomed, the wealth of the city has grown, and by the time we get to the 1290s, they are ready to now have a larger cathedral to replace the cramped and unsuitable conditions of the earlier church. Arnolfo di Cambio was the original architect, and the orange plan here is based on his designs. He did not live very long into his oversight of this building at all. Just a few years after the laying of the cornerstone, Arnolfo di Cambio himself dies, and there is a long interruption of the works. Later architects will take that plan and expand it further, and the present day cathedral that we have today is based on those enlargements that you can see in the lighter color here. So we've got a bit of an historical lasagna here when we think about buildings on top of buildings on top of buildings. And when we think about the fact that these architects seldom live to see the completion of these buildings, we have to appreciate that there are many hands at work over time in these projects. Following the death of Arnolfo di Cambio, Jotto Di Bondone in 1334 will be appointed to continue these works. After his death, a colleague and associate, Andrea Pizano, will continue. He will die, and then that will have to be handed over to Francesco Talenti, who eventually enlarges the plan of the cathedral. And right through the 1300s, we have this sort of story right up until the times of Filippo Brunelleschi. So again, we're going to narrow in on what is considered to be the second of the capo maestri, or chief architects of the cathedral project, and Giotto, being first and foremost a painter of frescoes and panel pieces, perhaps wisely chose to steer clear of the continuation of the cathedral construction. He instead dedicates and devotes his efforts to the design of a freestanding bell tower. And that is, again, the sort of heart of the matter today. So let's talk a bit about Jotto di Bondone. That tradition holds was born in 1267, and documentation confirms died on the 8th of January in 1337, just about 3 years after he began this work. So this is really the final project, let's say, of this artist's life, after great fame and celebrity had been given to him for his incredible works in fresco and tempera. Many of them are here in Florence, and when we want to find others, we have to go to some of the earlier biographers that look at the lives and the careers of these artists. Most importantly for us in Italy is the text published by Giorgio Vasari in the 16th century, known as The Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. And in this book, we see that Giotto has a very important position in a series of biographies, and his life and works are used by Vasari to suggest a rebirth of the arts already before the arrival of the Black Death in 1348. You can find translations of Vasari in pretty much any language on earth, often online, often for free. There are variations, of course, between the original and the abridged translations, but this is pretty easy to find. So I would encourage you to read up on Giotto in the Lives of Vasari if this is something that you'd like to learn more about. One of the things that we find emphasized again and again in the life of Giotto, as well as in the life of his teacher that precedes him, Cimabue, is that these two artists together are responsible for translating a language of painting that was at the time considered to be essentially imported from earlier traditions of Byzantium in the East into a local Latin tradition. A poetic way to say that is that Giotto had successfully managed to translate the language of painting from Greek into Latin, and is therefore considered to be a founding father of the local Florentine school of painting. He was discovered by his master, Cimabue, and if we're to believe these legends, they sort of, verge on mythology. He was discovered as a humble sort of pasture boy up in the hills, drawing on a stone, making little drawings of the sheep that he was looking after in his pasture, and Cimabue, riding down the street, was able to see the talent of this young boy and asks the father if he can take him into the city of Florence to begin an apprenticeship in his workshop and learn and develop his skills in drawing and painting. So because of the close connection of these two artists, it is usually this 100-year period, starting with the birth of Cimabue in 1240 and the death of Giotto just before 1340, that we have this idea of the first flourishing of the arts in Florence. That, of course, will be interrupted by the Black Death mid-century, but is quickly resumed by the artists of the city in the early 1400s. Here's an example of the painting of Giotto, just to give you an idea of what we'll see in terms of design in the bell tower. This is a crucifix that can be found today in the Dominican Basilica of Santa Maria Novella here in Florence, and was produced in the last years of the 1200s. Perhaps earlier than that, and certainly following the production of that crucifix, Giotto had been invited also to the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, initially with his master as an assistant, and later in his own right, to contribute to the ambitious decorative program of frescoes, both in the lower and upper churches of that building. What I'm showing you here is the nave of the upper basilica at Assisi, in which scenes of the life of St. Francis, attributed largely to Giotto, can be seen on the lateral walls. The masterpiece of Giotto's painting is instead found in Padova in the north, just outside of Venice, in a private family chapel known as the Scrovegni Chapel or the Arena Chapel, in which Giotto in the early years of the 1300s produces magnificent fresco programs depicting scenes of the life of Joachim, Mary, and Christ, as well as an imposing Last Judgment mural on the counter facade of this chapel. It is within that crowded group of the elect that we find in the Last Judgment, amongst many figures, one in particular that has been suggested to be a humble self-portrait of the artist. And when we look at later periods, artists start to get more overt in terms of their autograph and including self-portraits of themselves in these sorts of groupings and paintings. That's not so common in the Middle Ages, and we're not sure if it's actually true, but for the sake of it, let's just, pretend that this is what this figure would have looked like. We really have no idea what the artist would have looked like, but if we're to believe the story that this is in fact a self-portrait painted by him, along with the descriptions of his humility and good character, perhaps this is a good place to start thinking about the figure who is at the center of our talk tonight. Returning to Florence after this great commission by the Scrovegni family in Padova, Giotto continues to supply decorations in the form of important altarpieces for Florentine churches, including the Church of the Ognissanti, which at the time was administered by the Order of the Umiliati. And if you've been to Florence and have sought out medieval frescoes, I'm sure you will know that there are important family chapels also in the Franciscan Basilica of Santa Croce, frescoed by him for the Peruzzi and Bardi families, respectively. So again, this is a long, very full career, lots of painting, lots of panels, lots of objects. He amasses a large bottega or studio in which many of the principal artists of the next generation trained as pupils. And this idea of Giotto as architect has been revisited by historians as early as the 19th century. But it's for this reason that we don't have a lot of tangible work to connect to him specifically, that he remains in modern times considered primarily a painter. Let's take a look now at what someone who is so good at painting can do with the design of a bell tower for his own city's cathedral. Here is an old photograph showing you the same view that I'd given you before. This is a square that was also modified in the 16th century and in the 19th century, so the spaces are a bit different than they would have been at the time that Giotto was alive. But this is the work that, again, is going to be begun based on his designs and his oversight. He dies relatively quickly afterwards, and the architects and builders that follow him seem to have taken his plans and his designs very seriously and did not alter from them all that much. So we're not going to be talking just about the construction of a building today. We're also going to be talking about the decorative programs that we understand Giotto to have thought about very carefully at the time that the building was being constructed. I'm not going to read all this out to you, but this is just an excerpt from the life of Vasari, which talks about this involvement of Giotto in the design and construction of the bell tower just before his death. And he tells us, and I've highlighted that here for you in yellow, that based on the writings of an earlier artist in the 1500s, Lorenzo Ghiberti, whose commentaries are another very valuable source of information from artists of his time and those that came before him, he tells us that Giotto was not only the architect to design this building, but he was very much involved in a very detailed way in the decorative programs of relief carvings and statues to populate the niches of this building. And it would be those designs, the subject matter chosen, as well as the sort of specific figures in terms of statues to be represented, that will be carried out by artists right up until the early 1400s. And Ghiberti tells us that he himself had seen models that were made, maybe wax models, clay models, by Giotto himself, and those were given over to his close associate, Andrea Pizano, for their realization in marble carving. So if we really want to think about how much of this bell tower is actually Giotto, it's kind of disappointing. It's really limited to the base or the socle, what we would call the zoccolo in Italian. And this was only a 3-year period before Giotto's death, in which he is on site, on the work site, overseeing the excavation for the foundations. And that's about 20 braccia into the ground, laying layers of concrete and gravel to make sure that there is enough support to ensure the structural stability of what he envisions originally to be an enormous tower. Andrea Pizano, before his death in 1348 at least, will carry that up to the next 3 stories. If we compare this lower section of the bell tower to a design which is believed to be by Giotto himself, this is preserved in the archives of Siena today, we see a building whose upper levels are departing significantly from what we find today. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but this sort of large pyramidal kind of spire at the top of the building was never carried out. I don't know if that was in disrespect to Giotto as much as concern for this building sort of falling over, because of course, when you're working on such a concentrated area of land, you have to be very sure that not too much weight is being driven down into those foundations. Perhaps it was considered taking the safe route to cap this tower off at a lower height. Incidentally, the height of the tower today is 84.7 meters. It's just about 10 meters lower than the bell tower of Florence's city hall, Palazzo Vecchio. And together with that tower and the cupola of Brunelleschi, these are really the 3 elevations that define the skyline of the city of Florence today. Had this pinnacle designed by Giotto been constructed, it would have added an additional 30 meters to the bell tower, bringing it to a total height of somewhere between 110 and 115 meters. The reliefs that we're going to look at today were produced by an artist named Andrea Pizano, who had already won great fame amongst Florentines for his construction, design, and casting of bronze doors for one of the 3 portals of the baptistry, just next to the bell tower, representing scenes of the life of St. John the Baptist, to whom the baptistry is dedicated, set within quatrefoils and organized into a beautiful coffered pair of doors. And we think that this is what is securing Andrea's role in future work here in Florence, in particular, the continuation of the construction and decoration of the bell tower following the death of Giotto. So looking now again at this diagram of the lower section, I will point out to you that there is an initial story in which the marble revetment of the zoccolo, or the socle, contain hexagons. These are relief carvings. If we move up to the second level, we can see lozenges, these diamond-shaped spaces that have been planned for the embellishment with relief carvings. And if we move up to the first level before the windows, we can see that there are also niches in which prophets, mostly prophets, also other historical figures, were planned to adorn and look down on the people of Florence walking through the piazza below. And this is a four-sided building, so the program is rather complex. If we count them all, they're not all the same because we've got doorways, we've got other things on sides of the building that don't give us an exactly equal number. But the total of this decorative program of carvings and sculptures amounts to 26 hexagons, 28 lozenges, and 16 niches with statues. There is a wonderful fresco also in the proximity of the bell tower, located in a building known as the Misericordia. And that mural representing the Madonna of Mercy contains a wonderful view of the city of Florence at the time of its creation in the year 1342. It's located here just at the base of the Madonna, together with all of her supplicants here looking up in prayer. And I want to show you a detail of this fresco because it includes a representation of the baptistry, as well as the bell tower and the cathedral itself, the latter two, of course, at nowhere near a state of completion before the plague. Oops, I'm going backwards here. Here's that view. And you can see, again, very clearly the marble revetment and lead tile roofs of the baptistry. We can see a representation of the Palazzo Vecchio behind it. And just over here, we can see the roof of the pre-existing Church of Santa Reparata, the marble facade of the new enlarged cathedral, as well as the first stories of the bell tower. So again, even by 1342, this thing is nowhere near complete. It's going to take many generations to finally get this finished. And it will be largely the work of Francesco Talenti after the plague, who will bring this building up to its present height. Whether or not it was structural concerns or lack of funds, we're not really sure. Vasari's a bit political about this when he writes an explanation as to why these designs of Giotto for a pyramidal or pointed top were not honored. And he tells us that the campanile was destined, according to the model of Giotto, to have a spire, or rather a pyramid, 4-sided and 50 braccia high, as a completion to what is now seen. But for the reason that it was a German idea, and an old manner, modern architects have never done aught but advised that it should not be made. And the work seems to be better as is. So again, we don't really even have a full idea in the present realization of what Giotto had hoped. We have to imagine that an even taller rising pyramid here would have given a very different impression to the building today. The sculptors who are involved in the carving of these decorations include Andrea Pizano, as I had mentioned, working probably in part with Giotto at the end of his life, perhaps working from models provided by Giotto. Those lozenges and hexagons are completed by Luca della Robbia in the 1400s. And when we look up to the statues in the niches, which were produced for the most part in the 1400s, a few were begun by Andrea Pizano, but most of them were finished off by artists including Mazza di Banco, Donatello, and Nanni di Bartolo. And at the end of the talk, we'll take a look at a few of the sculptures that were provided by Donatello for the completion of this decorative program. But before we take a look at individual works, I wanted to give you an idea of what these represent as a whole, how their programs can be read individually and perhaps even in combination. And I guess the easiest way to look at these works of art today is to visit the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo behind the cathedral and the bell tower, because the original sculptures were removed from the tower in the late 19th century, restored and put into a museum environment for their protection. And this is one of the things that we like to do in Florence, basically go and look at copies up on the buildings to get an understanding of where these great works of art would have been located originally, but put them into museums to give us better access and of course protection for the works. And you might think to have all of those hexagons and lozenges and sculptures kind of copied in order to replace them on the original building would be a lot of work and a lot of time. We're very lucky here in Florence because since the very beginning, the administrators of the cathedral had organized for a group of stone carving masters to look over the maintenance of the building, repair works, and that body exists still today in the form of the Bottega of the cathedral. And walking just down the Via dello Studio off the south flank of the transept of the cathedral, you can find the studio. Sometimes it's closed, sometimes it's open. When it's open, you can peek out inside and it's pretty interesting. But I'm showing you here in the foreground at the base of the Torre Pirozzi is the Bottega dell'Opera di Santa Maria del Fiore. So this is literally the workshop of the board of the Florentine Cathedral. It's located in a modest building here, and when this grille is opened, inside you can see the work that is still being carried out to remove original sculptures from the 19th century facade of the cathedral to replace them with copies, allowing the originals to be joined to earlier objects in the museum for their protection. So it's interesting to see that we're using many of the same methods still today in order to produce these works. Already we can see a few examples of the hexagons of Giotto and Andrea Pizano in terms of plaster casts up here attached to the railing. Not only are we concerned with relief carvings and statues, we're also concerned with the architectural elements, these wonderful spiraling columns that are often inlaid with glass and multicolored stone. Many of the tracings from the windows are also being currently copied in order to put them up there to be able to preserve the originals. So this is an ongoing process, and at this point we're basically at 700 years. These guys aren't going anywhere. There's still plenty of work to do, but it's a wonderful way to think about how we protect these buildings, how we ensure that they will be available for future generations, and it's a wonderful part of the modern artistry of the city of Florence today. The hexagons, which make their way around the four sides of the base of the cathedral, are representations of biblical stories, as well as another sort of realm of subject matter, which we find addressed in religious art as well as pagan art, referring to the mechanical arts and the liberal arts. The curriculum of the liberal arts, of course, made available to freedmen in antiquity, the sorts of subjects that are considered essential for a well-rounded education. And these make their way around, and you can do this because they're the lowest ones. You can really walk around the bell tower and look at all of them. And to give you an idea of the subject matter that they represent, on the face of the bell tower that looks out into the piazza towards the baptistry, we have the earliest subjects and probably the earliest carvings in terms of the group representing the first labors. They're selected from Genesis and begin with the first examples of creation, the creation of Adam and Eve, and move on to the establishment of the first labors in mechanical arts, including domestication, music, metallurgy, and viticulture. As you make your way around the side of the building, the program continues, and we see representations of astronomy, building or architecture, medicine, hunting, weaving, legislation, and technology. Moving round towards the back, where there is incidentally the entrance to the building. When things get back to normal, you can climb all the way up to the very, very top and find beautiful views of the city. We see navigation, justice, agriculture, theater, architecture, sculpture, and painting. And the ones that are perhaps a bit more difficult to find because they're on the final side, which sort of faces the flank of the cathedral, and that is fenced off at the moment, are representations of sculpture, painting, harmony, grammar, logic, music, and geometry. If you're wondering why these things are on a bell tower, you know, we can talk about this. I think that there is something to be said about the use of the liberal arts and the mechanical arts as a way to celebrate human activity, human creativity, the advancement of mankind through its story, which of course for Italians of this period begins with the story of creation found in Genesis. So starting with the creation of the first man and woman and moving through these these technological and artistic firsts, we're starting to see a story of art really emerge in the choice and the selection of these subjects. The lozenges, which are unfortunately not really produced to any great extent before the plague, but are largely finished off in the beginning of the 15th century, become even more interesting because, again, with these 7 sides of revetment on each side of the building, we can start to make interesting connections between not just what we have going around, but also as we look at hexagons and lozenges and the statues above. These are very interesting things to look at. Again, perhaps better to see in the museum where you can get close to them, but I would always recommend after a visit to the museum to go back to the piazza and look up at these works the way that their artists had originally intended. There in the lozenges, we find selections of the 7 planets, the 7 virtues, a return to the 7 liberal arts, as well as the 7 sacraments. And in this case, we are looking at, again, as a fusion of pagan mythological ideas as well as religious ideas that together were considered to be the forces controlling human behavior and human activity. In the case of the planets, virtues, liberal arts, and sacraments, these are the tools through which we find the regulation of human existence, in terms of, if you like to read your horoscope in the paper, right? Fortification of human integrity, education, and sanctification. So again, an idea that this bell tower is speaking very directly to the Florentine people about expectations of behavior and the necessities employed in the insurance of a healthy and functioning society. I wanted to take a look now at some of the sculptures that were produced for the upper niches. Again, there are 17 of them. We don't have time to look at all of them, but just to give you an idea how something like one monument in the city of Florence can be used to understand quite well the advancements made in the arts of carving and decoration from the 1300s to the 1400s, taking a look at those few figures that Andrea Pizano managed to finish in the 1340s before the plague. We have selections of Old Testament kings, including King David and King Solomon, as well as Greek prophetesses and Roman prophetesses known as Sibyls. And here we have the Tiberian Sibyl and the Eritrean Sibyl. So again, something that we might not sort of think about as being a normal way to decorate a religious building. But let's remember that this is what Michelangelo was doing on the Sistine ceiling in the early 1500s, giving us Greek Sibyls together with the patriarchs and the ancestors of Christ. So the sort of fusion of 2 worlds to give us an idea of how one reinforces and also sort of prophesizes the next. This is already common practice in the Middle Ages. There are 5 works that were produced by Donatello in the early 1400s that are autographed. In this case, they're autographed on the bases, which is a bit funny to think if they're being positioned sort of 20 meters above the ground. Not many people are going to see that. Perhaps that was intended for a divine audience in terms of ensuring the artist's own salvation. But I wanted to point out one of them here to you. Those of you who are joining us from New York might remember that 2 of these statues traveled recently, I believe back in 2015, and were on display temporarily there, including the group representing Abraham and Isaac, his son, the sacrifice of Isaac, as well as this figure, who we're still not exactly sure who it represents, commonly referred to as Habakkuk, the Old Testament prophet, and colloquially known here in Florence as the Zukone, or the pumpkin head, or the squash head. And this is the artist that I wanted to sort of, the work of art that I wanted to sort of end off with today, because I think it's a wonderful example of how these elevations now in buildings begun in the Middle Ages are used by sculptors very, very carefully to work out the way these figures have to be carved, how they have to be designed. What is the difference from looking at a work of art on a pedestal in a museum and looking at it outside, you know, in the elements, in direct sunlight, often at elevations far above eye level? Taking a look at the last work here, the Zukone, and perhaps that name of pumpkin head or squash head comes from the fact that this is a balded figure. This is a wonderful work of art that, again, you can get close to in the museum. It has been often cited as one of the works that Donatello himself was most proud of, with apprentices claiming to have witnessed him during the period of carving, sort of looking at this figure and saying, speak, you know, speak, damn you, the only thing this thing can't do is speak, something reminiscent of the tale of Pygmalion. It's a wonderful work of art that, again, can be sort of viewed in the museum environment, but it is not so easy in the museum to understand how this work of art would be viewed way up in these niches above the roof line. So one of the things that we really tune into when we look at the sculpture of Donatello and the artists of his generation is this concern of the legibility and the reading of sculpture, even at extreme heights. How do these works look when they are foreshortened dramatically in the case of these works? Some of you might be familiar with another important building here in Florence, which has a Renaissance program of sculptural decoration with figures set into niches, and that is the Church of Orsami. Those works are basically just above eye level. These are much, much higher. And the side that I'm showing you here in this photograph is the side in which the niches contain the copies of the earlier works by Andrea Pizano. To take a look at the genius of Donatello, again, I think it's nice to tune into the Zukone because it is a work that has a very different appearance when you are looking up at it. There are a couple of terms that we use in art history to explain this sort of idea of anticipating a foreshortened viewing experience. One of them is optical correction. Basically meaning that the lower section of the sculpture is going to be closer to the viewer and the upper extent of the sculpture is going to be further away. And therefore, a sculptor needs to compensate for that, either by elongating the upper register or shortening slightly the lower register. And taking a look at a photograph here of the copy in the niche today, you can see how beautifully that results in a very clear reading of this work, even if you're sort of getting a crick in the neck looking up at it. Another term that we use, an Italian term here, to think about this way that we experience works of art as viewers, is the expression da sotto in su, or from below looking upwards. We use this not only for sculptures at elevations like this in architecture, but also ceiling paintings and other sorts of things that we have to look up at. So da sotto in su, from below looking upward, we can see that there is not a single element of the sculpture that is obscured or hidden or confused by this very extreme sort of viewing angle. It's absolutely brilliant example of the thought and the care that Donatello would have put into these works, not only at the bell tower, but also his celebrated works for the Church of Orsami down the street. The works have been moved around. They're not in the original niches. The copies aren't even in the original niches that they were intended for. And that is because historically, the layout of the piazza around the cathedral and the bell tower was quite different. What you can see here are the footprints of the original Cannery Buildings that were largely regularized in the 19th century. We've got a nice sort of flat side to this square today that allows you ample space to walk around and look at this building from a distance. But back at the time, there would have been a very, very narrow passageway here, as well as a passageway between the bell tower and the cathedral. So we know that, in fact, the original idea was that the Donatello sculptures would have been positioned on the side that faces the cathedral. And also for this, looking at this not just from below, but also from the side. The cathedral is there. You can't get in front of the side of the building. Donatello is also thinking about the legibility of this figure, his clothing, his facial expression, not only from a high distance, but also from a sort of a sideways viewing angle. So just further emphasizing the idea that this is one of the greatest sculptures that Florence has ever produced. He is a prophet, and like many prophets that we have, coming from the Judaic tradition that are still recognized by Jews, Christians, and Muslims together. Habakkuk, if this is really who it is, the Pumpkinhead is one of the authors of the books of the Hebrew Bible. There's the book of Habakkuk, which tells of his prophecies delivered by God, in which he is informed of an impending revelation, revelation in this case being interchangeable with apocalypse, basically, and having the charge to go and convince his people to, obey God, fear God. This is going to happen. We've got to be prepared. And I always think about this idea of prophecy as being, a terrible thing to do to someone. Imagine being given an idea of what's going to happen in the future, and then having to go and convince everyone, that you're not absolutely crazy. And if you think of those guys downtown with these signs, the end is near, repent, 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 they always tend to have a little bit of a sort of an unhinged and even sort of crazy look. And I think that's something that was also incorporated here into the sculpture of Donatello. Taking a look at the original in the museum, you can see trembling lips, a fearful expression in his eyes, sort of a cringing in his body language. And it's, again, just a great example of how we can look not just at the bell towers being a huge, colossal, musical instrument, but one that is calling in many ways, not just with the acoustics of the bells, but also with the stories attached to the sculptures that are part of its earliest design and decoration left to us by Giotto long before the plague. The last thing that I'll say before we open it up to questions is that the bell tower today is, of course, one of the great monuments of the city. People love to photograph it. People love to climb it. We do have to return to the building occasionally to ensure that it is structurally sound and that pieces aren't going to be falling on top of us. And that's carried out relatively regularly. And there was some wonderful news in 2018 following one of these works. You'll notice that this building, together with many others in Florence, have often series of holes that are left on the sides of the building. And these are known as buche pontaie, or literally holes for the scaffolding. They were used by the original builders to construct the wooden scaffolds that would allow for the construction of these buildings. And they were often left, knowing that there would eventually be need for repair work. Modern restorers use these same holes to construct what are now, steel scaffolds to cover these buildings and access their elevations. And when we look at them, again, there's sort of a great thing left to us by these earlier architects that helps us preserve the buildings. But back in 2018, in one of these buche pontaie, a technical worker discovered very accidentally that the hole had been used as a nest of an Italian peregrine falcon. And like many other parts of Europe, this is one of the birds of prey that much work has been done to reintroduce and ensure its sort of repopulation. Also here in Italy, in the Italian Alps and in the Apennines. And for us in Florence to have peregrines sort of flying around the city is a wonderful addition to what we look up at in terms of this architecture. They also eat pigeons, right? So, I mean, what better thing to have nesting in the largest tower of the city? We have a few examples of these birds returning to urban areas. I remember being in Norwich for a conference years ago, and there were birds nesting in the bell tower of that cathedral, and the authorities had set up a live webcam. You could sort of Google the birds and sort of watch them in their nest. We're not able to do that in these smaller holes of the buche pontaie left to us by Giotto, and I'm sure he didn't think that that would eventually be a home for falcons. But when we think about how these buildings were made and how that evidence is left for us today, and perhaps even used in unexpected ways, it all adds to the richness in the story of this monument, which remains at the center of Florentine history and Florentine art. So the next time you're here, I'm hoping you can go and enjoy the facsimiles that are adorning the niches and the elevations of the building. And you might as well go into the museum and take a look at the originals as well, because they are truly beyond compare. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy. And we can now let people pop up. So if you want to engage, you can show your video now. And we'll go to the questions as Jeremy invited. And as usual, we have two ways of doing this. If you want to pop a question or comment into the chats, I'll try and read it out on your behalf. But we're very pleased if people want to speak directly. And the way to do that is simply to wave and unmute and off you go. So whilst you're having a think, I did see one question in the chat, which I'll get up now, which is, from the Visual Arts Alliance. In modern times, what problems have been associated with people at the top of the tower? Suicides, question mark? Vandalism, question mark? Throwing objects? Tell us about delinquent behavior on top of the tower, Jeremy.
I would say on the lighter side, you have problems with graffiti. People love to leave their mark when they go to these sorts of places, traveling across the world, school groups, those kinds of things. There have been a couple of instances, not only in the bell tower, but also and the lantern of the cupola, the dome of the cathedral, that can also be ascended, that we've got autographs and tags and these sorts of things that are damaging to the marble. Marble's very porous, so it's not easy to clean off. And on the more extreme side, yes, there have been attempted suicides from the heights of the bell tower. If you climb it today or when it reopens, you'll see that you've got something like the fencing behind the home base on a baseball field. You know, these sort of large curving fences that allow people to not get into trouble. And for the safety of anything that might become dislodged and fall to the ground, there are also sort of preventative nets about 2/3 of the way up of the building.
Thank you. Another one in the chat, and then I'll ask people if they want to come in live. From Brenda Moore McCann, can you talk about the color scheme, please?
The color scheme is based on materials, which are predominantly marbles and hard stones. The white marble was taken from the quarries north of Pisa in an area called Carrara, as they had been for the baptistry, whose revetment, we talk about revetment as the term of sort of putting slabs or sheaths of marble on the exterior of a masonry building. And what we find throughout sort of Romanesque Italy is a tradition of contrasting lighter stone with darker stone in order to provide geometric patterns, dematerialize those walls, sort of break them up, make them more interesting. So in the case of all of those buildings in the cathedral complex, the dark green stone that you see, which is referred to as serpentina, comes from the nearby city of Prato. What we also have is a pink stone on the baptistry as well as in sections of the cathedral itself, and that comes from other areas of Tuscany closer towards the southern coast in the area of Maremma. So I don't think that the colors are symbolic necessarily, but the materials would have been read as local materials and an example of continuing the traditions of earlier architects and builders in the Middle Ages.
Very good, thanks, Jeremy. Right, okay, opening it up to the floor. Penny, I see you're unmuted. Is that intentionally or not?
I was just writing something. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Yes, I was just wondering about the Biscari. You know, the Florentines refer to the Biscari, who were based around who had some buildings around the cathedral. And Florentines tend to describe stupid people as the Biscari because they didn't sell off these things. They didn't want them knocked down.
Yeah, there's a story about that. A family known as the Biscari who, like when you got to get the new motorway laid down and you've got the guy that doesn't want to sell the farm, right, causing the problem, maybe trying to get more money out of the government than they're willing to pay, trying to sort of, bet on how much they can get out of it. Basically, there was an uncooperative family known as the Biscari. They tried to hold out, tried to sort of extort the government and the cathedral authorities for money. And at a certain point, they just made a new law that said that they were able to take these buildings away from the citizens, whether they liked it or not. So the Biscari got nothing out of it, and they lost their home. So we got a cathedral out of it, but Biscari is used as a term basically for someone who sort of, bet badly and lost, on something, or basically someone who's, trying to do things in maybe in a dishonest way and ending out not on top.
Yeah, that's great, thank you.
And if there are Florentines in the audience that want to add to that, I mean, that really is a true kind of local Florentine thing. And it's a great example. We've got loads and loads of them.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, other voices. Yes, Brenda.
I'm just wondering, can you point out any other buildings that that we know Giotto built or was involved with?
There's a wall tomb in Arezzo that has been already sort of attributed to him by Vasari, and that has been sort of argued about by historians. And I think for the most part, it is confirmed and sort of understood to be a work that is at least based on his designs. But again, we have to appreciate that for someone like Giotto, who is so masterful in drawing, he might be ahead of his time in the sense of what we would consider today to be a paper architect, someone who isn't so concerned with the statics and the physics of building, but what it should look like at the end. So whether he's the person who's like, putting the blocks together, probably not. If he's the person who's providing the designs, on paper and drawing for these things, that's more of a likelihood. That's more of a possibility. So there are a couple of wall tombs that have been attributed to him, but the bell tower is really the only significant freestanding structure to which he is assuredly credited. And it's the fame already enjoyed in his own time, which leads to his sort of honorary citizenship of the city. He's given great sort of honors by the city. So that's all been handed down, not just by Vasari, but by the chroniclers and the historians, and the documents that survive in the archives of the Opera del Duomo. That all confirms, that this was really his last great role. And whether he was, again, measuring out, he had the people who knew how to build things with him. I want it to look like this. Can it look like this? All right, so it's not a single-handed endeavor, but maybe paper architect is a better way to refer to him. And I don't think that we have any other really freestanding buildings that can be assuredly attributed to him.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions, folks?
I was interested in that picture in the loggia of the cathedral, which had a marble facade, because I hadn't realized there was a marble facade before the 19th century one. Can you tell us a bit what happened in between times?
There was a very ambitious facade program already introduced by the first architect, Arnolfo di Cambio. And it is constructed in large part, up the first third of the elevation. And it's there right up until, I think, the 1500s. Donatello had also produced sculptures for the niches of that facade on the cathedral itself, including the St. John, which is in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo today. And the wonderful thing that they've done recently in the opening of the new museum of the cathedral is reconstruct that facade based on a very accurate drawing that was left to us by Bernardino Pochetti. And it was so sort of detailed in terms of where all those original sculptures were that we were able to reconstruct it. It was eventually demolished, and if you look at photographs of the cathedral before its 1880s facade left by Emilio de Fabris, you can find photographs online of a very weird building. You've got all this marble going along the sides, and you've got the dome, and you've got the bell tower, and you've got the baptistry, and the front just looks like a plastered over, almost something like Santa Spirito on the south side of the river, a very undecorated, flat, monochrome facade. So that was, again, something that even the Medici princes had tried to correct. There were competitions and juries held, basically inviting artists to provide designs in the 1500s and 1600s to get a facade on that building. You can find those models and drawings also in the museum. I think we're pretty lucky that they never sort of did anything back then, because it'd be hard to imagine the Cathedral of Florence with this sort of big Baroque facade. But you can get an idea of that long story of the facade also in a section of the museum that's devoted specifically to it, going right up until the time of the actual neo-Gothic facade in the 1880s.
Thank you. Seems to be a major problem in Florence. Facades, there's San Lorenzo, Santo Spirito.
Usually the last thing to be done. Usually you run out of money first, or another war starts, and yep. Remember too that Santa Croce did not have a facade until the 19th century, and that was produced by Niccolo Matas in the 1840s. So a neo-Gothic facade, we would refer to it, just to specify that it's not part of the original building.
Thank you. Before I take the next question, I just want to put in my regular weekly plea for donations. It is our practice to offer these lectures to everybody, but anyone who wishes to make a donation of whatever size you feel comfortable with, Sarah will put up the link, and it all helps to keep the Institute going at a time when we're not able to do a lot of our activities in the Palazzo because of COVID restrictions. So thank you in advance for any contributions that you can make. So a question on the chat from Lindsay Chappell. says, you talked about the common practice of fusing worlds, pagan and Christian, Byzantine and Latin, in which Giotto participated. How has the blended iconography been received in later centuries? Has the narrative around the iconography remained consistent? Tough question.
I think if anything, you see an end to that introduced with the reforms of the Counter-Reformation. That's something that, you know, we find medieval frescoes that play with this kind of subject matter. We find Renaissance works of art. Thinking about the famous fresco of Raphael, for example, with all of these great philosophers in the Stanze della Segnatura down at the Vatican. On the other side of the room is a sort of a mirrored fresco which shows all of the great figures of the church. So the marriage of those two worlds is something that was, you know, regularly accepted and understood to be the new, you know, doubly informed truth being communicated by the church and its authorities. And I think that you're going to start seeing an end to that along with a lot of other stuff following the series of ecumenical councils that are held in Bologna and Trent, known as the Council of Trent in post-Tridentine art. I think you know, might be part of the reason that we don't see that carried out much further than the 16th century.
Very good.
It is too sensitive.
Anyone else with anything else they'd like to add? Okay, we might be coming towards the end. Well, if there's nothing more in the chat, nobody want to say last words? In which case it's probably time to draw this evening's session to a close. To thank, on behalf of everybody, to thank Jeremy very much indeed for a really interesting and illuminating talk about the Campanile. Thank you all for participating. Thanks again in advance for your contributions and donations. And I hope to see you all next week for Alan Pascucci's talk about how the Renaissance bronzes were cast. And don't forget to drop in to the the History of Art seminars as and when you would like to attend a particular session, or indeed buy the whole program. All details will follow in what's on and is always on the website. So good night, everybody. Have a good evening wherever you are. Or Barbara, have a good day over on the West Coast. And that's it, I think. So, night, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.